The infusion system is one of the best things about Elden Ring. It lets you freely change the affinity on any single regular smithing weapon at basically any point in the game, as long as you do have the corresponding wet blades. And this infusion system does cover multiple different types of builds. There's basically one for every single stat, covering every single element and a handful of different status effects too. Would have been nice if you had like an intelligence faith-based infusion, or like a Scarlet Rot-based infusion. That would have been pretty cool. But the way that these infusions actually work is that it lowers the base damage, but it improves the scaling of a particular stat. And with some particular infusions like Heavy, Keen, and Quality, they also have the ability to be buffed as well. So you can throw in things like Grease or Blood Flame Blade, Black Flame Blade, alongside these particular infusions too. Now for today, we are going to rank all 13 of them from worst to best, and the criteria is going to be based on how useful it is in just PvE. Also going to take into account their actual Ash of War options as well that every single one of these affinities actually house. Now do keep in mind that every single one of these infusions actually have a use, and more likely than not, depending on the weapon that you want to use, or depending if we want to use certain types of spells or what's not, will be dependent on which actual affinity that you choose for your specific weapon. So just because something does get lower on the list doesn't mean it's a useless infusion. The purpose of this video is just so I can tell you about the uses for every single infusion, and we're just going to rank them for fun. To start off with, at the bottom we have the Poison Infusion, which this gives your weapon a strength and or dexterity scaling, also somewhat of an arcane scaling. In almost every single instance it will just end up being a D-scaling in arcane. But it also does add a whole bunch of poison build-up to your weapon too. Now the damage and scalings of the Poison Infusion are basically identical to the Bleed Infusion. The only differences being is that one's going to do bleed and one's going to do poison, and the poison status effect is just not good at all. Especially if you do compare it to bleed, so it's just directly outclassed in my opinion. Because poison as a status effect does roughly 6% damage over 90 seconds, which for comparison, if you proc bleed one time, it does 10% damage basically in an instant. Now the Poison Infusion alongside the Venomous Fang still actually retains the deadly poison buildup, which that does make it a little bit better. But honestly, I wouldn't even care to go with a Poison Infusion in that instance either, because the scalings aren't going to be that good. And you're probably just better off going into an Occult Infusion in that instance, because you're just going to get way more damage, get better synergy with spells, and potentially get more poison buildup too. And even if you wanted to use poison types of skills, it actually is going to just do more damage with the Occult Infusion, because these types of skills will typically scale off the Arcane stat. And being that the Poison Infusion only gets a D scaling in Arcane in most cases, compared to the Occult Infusion, which typically gets like a B or an A scaling, that's going to perform much better. So unfortunately, the trade-off in base damage and scalings that you take a hit to are just not well compensated when it comes to the poison status effect. Number 12, the Standard Infusion. This one is just basically just leaving your weapon as it is. You do actually have the option to just make it standard infused with every single Ash of War, and it's just going to retain the same scalings and base damage. Now, typically when it comes to infusions, it lowers the base damage, but it improves the scalings. So therefore, at higher levels, or when you actually have your weapon leveled up a bit more, you're going to benefit a lot more if you go into the other infusions. But the Standard Infusion can literally be the best one at early levels. The Standard Infusion is probably just going to be the best option until you just level it up a bit more. Infusions also do lower your guard boost and guarded damage negation for a bunch of different stats. And if you go with certain elemental infusions, it actually could increase the guarded damage negation. But for the most part, that's kind of like a negative side effect. And if you're using a shield, I'll just leave it standard infused every single time. But that's basically the only use of this infusion, with shields and this early game. Number 11, the Fire Infusion, which obviously gives your weapon some split fire damage and also gives you a strength-based scaling. Now, this strength scaling is not going to be anywhere near as good as the Heavy Infusion. And also accounting for split damage, the Heavy Infusion could probably just outdamage the Fire Infusion in almost every single instance, unless you're fighting enemies that are weaker to fire damage and using the fire types of buffs. But even then, you could still use the fire-based Ashes of War with a Heavy Infusion, because funnily enough, if you use things like Flame of the Red Manes, Flaming Strike, they're going to scale best of strength, and being that the Heavy Infusion gets you a better strength scaling than a Fire Infusion would, you're just going to get more damage there. And also, if you really wanted to go with a fire-based build, the Flame Art Infusion just directly outclasses this, because the Flame Art Infusion gives you higher base damage, and it also gives you a faith-based scaling, so it gives you the option to synergize well with certain types of spells. Now, the only other use that the Fire Infusion does have is if you're going with a strength-based build that's good at stance breaking, then you can switch to a Fire-infused Misericord, because split damage doesn't actually matter when it comes to critical attacks. It's just purely based on your attack power. So the higher that number, the more damage the critical attack is going to do. But for outside of critical attacks, that's not necessarily the case, especially if you're fighting enemies resist to fire damage. So if you actually wanted to go with a strength-based build, I'm just going to leave the Heavy Infusion on 99% of the time. Number 10, we have the Quality Infusion, which gives your weapon a split even strength and dexterity scaling. Now, this infusion is purely just meant for higher levels. It is basically the best infusion to use if you have like level 200 and above. And also if you still wanted to be able to buff the weapon itself, because yes, this actually does have the ability to do that. Now, the thing is, what the quality infusion also does is lower the base damage dramatically and way more than the heavy and keen infusions do. So basically, if you are like between the levels of like 0 and 200, the heavy and keen infusion are just going to be way better. Now, another good thing about the quality infusion is that you're just going into split even strength and dexterity. Therefore, you actually can meet the requirements of a lot of different weapons in the game very easily. So if you actually were confused as to what build that you wanted to go with, you could just go into a quality build, because you can use almost any weapon that you want to. The only downside is that you're just not going to optimize your damage with that particular weapon. But once again, once you are at higher levels, then it does perform really well. But the thing is, at higher levels, there are other infusions out there that give you scalings in 3 different stats. Things like the cold infusion, the bleed infusion, and with some weapon combinations, you actually can retain some pretty decent scalings in all 3 stats. And these infusions are probably going to get you just as much damage, but probably get you a really good status effect on top of it, which I'm probably just going to value more. Number 9, we have the Lightning Infusion. Now, just as I talked about with the Fire Infusion, this is just the dexterity-based version. It gives you like a somewhat decent dexterity scaling and just a bunch of split lightning damage. Now, the reason why I'm going to value this one more than the Fire Infusion is because this is the only infusion that does get you lightning damage. And also, more enemies are weaker to lightning damage and less are resist to it. And as I mentioned with critical attacks, the split damage is not going to be a negative side effect here, because typically with a Lightning Infusion, you get a higher attack rating compared to a Keen Infusion. But because you're doing 2 different damage types, it has to go through 2 different defenses, and in that case, the Keen Infusion could still potentially just outdamage it, and also have the ability to be buffed, because yeah, unfortunately, the Lightning Infusion can just not be buffed at all. Now, you're going to have more use out of a lightning-based critical attack build than you would with a fire-based one, because if you do have a strength-based build, you're more likely than not going to have really high amounts of AR, but typically with a dexterity build, they're going to be smaller, quicker types of weapons, so the AR or the attack rating is going to be a lot smaller. So in that instance, you don't really need to go with like a fire-based misericord in the offhand to switch to after a stance break, but you would benefit a lot more with a lightning-based misericord, because the damage difference between that and your main weapon would be on average a lot larger than it would be with a fire infusion with a strength build. Now, as for the Ash of War options, things like Thunderbolts, Lightning Ram, Lightning Slash, they're actually all pretty decent, but just like the fire-based infusions, they're just not going to scale best off their own particular affinity, and in this instance, they're going to scale better off the Keen-based infusion. So if you actually wanted to maximize the damage of these lightning-based skills, Keen is just going to be best. And also the Sacred-based Ashes of War let you infuse it as lightning damage as well, so you could very well have Misericord Golden Vow and have it be lightning infused. So I think that's basically its only use, or once again, if you are fighting enemies weaker to lightning damage and using lightning types of buffs. Otherwise, if you have a dexterity build, just go into Keen every single time. At number 8, we have the Sacred Infusion, which this actually gives you a pure faith-based scaling, does dramatically decrease the dexterity and strength-based scaling, and it also does give you a bunch of holy damage as well, which holy damage is the worst damage type in the entire game. Specifically for the base game, there are so many bosses that are resist to holy damage and hardly any that are weaker to it. And unfortunately for Sacred Infusion, the Flame Art Infusion exists, which is another pure faith-based infusion, and this one gives you the exact same benefits in terms of base damage and scalings, but it just gives you fire damage instead, which is just the better damage type. And it also gets better Ash of War options as well. Things like Black Flame Tornado, Flame Spear, Flame Skewer. That's going to be better on average, but it's still going to be very useful, because when you do have a faith-based build and going into a faith infusion, mainly being Flame Art, there still are going to be a handful of enemies that do resist fire damage, and in that instance, you could just switch over to Sacred damage, and in the DLC, there are a handful of enemies weaker to Holy, so it actually does give it another use. And honestly, most of the best holy weapons in the game don't really get that good of a faith-based scaling. And going with a pure faith-based build is typically better to go with a New Game Plus, because you can benefit of more spell damage too. And sometimes going with a holy-based weapon is going to be more beneficial than going with like a fire-based weapon, because with a faith-based build, you're going to have access to lightning damage, fire damage anyway, and those spells are going to be better than the holy variants. So there are some circumstances where Sacred can be pretty decent to have, but for like 90% of faith-based builds when using weapons that can be infused, I'm probably going to go with a Flame Arts Infusion. The Magic Infusion. Now at this point, every single one of these are just extremely useful, and it's kind of hard to just rank them all from worst to best. But as for the Magic Infusion itself, this one obviously giving you some split magic damage and giving you a really good intelligence scaling, but in return, it does decrease both your strength and dexterity based scaling. So in building around this affinity, you just go all into intelligence. Now the thing is, with the pure intelligence build, it does have to compete with a lot of other different types of really powerful weapons. But as for the Ash of War options, they can be very useful. Things like Carrion Grandeur, Carrion Sovereignty are extremely powerful. Unfortunately, you don't really get like a magic weapon buff Ash of War like you do with the other elements. But I think the main reason why I'm going to put it a bit lower onto the list is because it has to compete with the Cold Infusion. And the thing is with a cold infusion, it doesn't really give you as good as an intelligence scaling. So with a pure intelligence build, obviously magic is going to be best. But the cold infusion actually can give you good scalings in multiple different stats. Sometimes even 3 stats, you can get some really good scalings. And at higher levels, the cold infusion is probably just going to be better than the magic infusion in almost every single instance. And on top of all that, you are getting passive frost buildup, which is one of the best status effects to have. Because obviously both are getting some split magic damage. The major difference is that the cold infusion actually gets more physical, whereas the magic infusion will typically just get more magic damage, which might make it more useful for enemies that are weaker to magic. But the thing is, there are hardly any enemies in this game that are weaker to magic damage. It's like a very neutral damage type, because there aren't many that are weak to it, and there aren't many that are resist. So once again, it actually is a pretty useful infusion, but I just don't really see it as useful as some of the other ones. Number 6, we have the Blood Infusion. Now, I could have easily put this one into the top 3 because literally any weapon with a Bleed Infusion is just like automatically made viable. Because Bleed as a status effect is just broken. It could do a flat 10% damage to bosses. You can proc it pretty quickly. Now, just like the Poison Infusion, it is just going to do pure physical damage. It is going to dramatically decrease the base damage. Probably not really give you that good of a strength or dexterity scaling either. Sometimes it can give you a quality scaling, and it also does give you an arcane scaling, albeit for most cases, it's just going to be like a D scaling in arcane. But there are some instances to where like a Bleed Infusion can just be utterly broken, namely like the Blood Fiend weapons. But the main reason why it's not going to get much higher is because if you wanted to optimize damage, things like Heavy and Keen Infusions are just going to perform better. And if you actually wanted to maximize damage and bleed buildup, then an Occult Infusion is typically going to be better for you. You probably won't really get as much bleed buildup, but you're definitely going to be getting more damage and almost as much blood loss buildup. If you actually use things like Seppuku, then it's going to be better, which that kind of leads me into the Ashes of Wars themselves. All the bleed-based skills that you get are going to scale better if you go with an Occult Infusion, more so than you would if you went with a Bleed Infusion, because they're going to scale purely off Arcane, where the Bleed Infusion is only really going to give you like a D scaling compared to like the Occult giving you like a B or an A scaling in Arcane. So for me personally, if I actually wanted to make a bleed-based weapon, I'm probably going to use a weapon that already comes with passive bleed, and then probably just going to slap a Heavy or Keen Infusion onto it so I can buff it with Blood Flame Blade, so I can actually maximize damage and get really good blood loss build up, sometimes even more so than I actually would with a Bleed Infusion. Or I could take those weapons and go into an Occult Infusion instead, because that's going to actually help us get really good synergy with spells and get a good mix up of damage and bleed build up too. But there are some instances out there to where you actually want to use a really cool weapon or particular weapon types and they don't really have like a bleed based weapon alternative. Then in that instance, the bleed based infusion is really good. Another benefit that the bleed infusion does have though is going to be like at really high levels or max level, because it does get scalings in 3 different stats. You have a very good chance of outdamaging things like a quality-based infusion. Now, quality could still get more because that has the ability to be buffed, whereas a bleed-based infusion cannot. However, you are going to get a whole bunch of bleed build-up, and being that you do have an arcane scaling, you actually benefit by getting more bleed build-up by going into the arcane stats. Now, typically, you don't really go into the arcane stat with a bleed-based infusion because it only gets a D scaling. But if you already hit the soft caps of things like strength and dexterity, you might as well. And not only are you going to benefit of some of the highest damage, but you get like insanely fast bleed build up. So it's just one of those things where you can slap it onto any weapon and be really good, but it's still pretty niche as it pertains to being optimal. Number 5, the Flame Art Infusion, which as I talked about with the Sacred Infusion, this is going to be your other faith-based infusion. And this one being the more useful one because it does fire damage instead of holy damage, which for a majority of the game is going to be much better to have. And as I mentioned, the Ash of War options, things like Flame Spear, Black Flame Tornado, that is going to be much better options. Like, it typically doesn't really matter because you can just go back and forth between Sacred Arts and Flame Arts infusions seamlessly with how good the infusion system is in this game. And also, there are just some weapons that are just broken to have with a Flame Arts infusion. Things like the Erdsteel Dagger, the Fire Knight's Greatsword. These could be some of the best faith weapons in the entire game, and pairing them with a Flame Arts infusion is going to be the optimal pairing. Number 4, we have the Cold Infusion, which this infusion does give you weapon scalings in 3 separate stats, which is very similar to things like the Magic and the Flame Art Infusion, but the major difference is that you actually can retain decent scalings in strength and dexterity, whereas for the Flame Art and Magic Infusion, you only get like an E scaling in those stats, so they're only meant for like a pure faith or intelligence build, whereas this infusion can just be completely random. Some weapons can actually get like a really good strength scaling, but a poor intelligence scaling. Others can get like a really good intelligence scaling, but a poor strength and dexterity scaling. And there are some cases that you get like really good scalings in 2 different stats, like the Backhand Blades getting you like a B scaling in both. And then sometimes you get scalings in 3 different stats, like the Dry Leaf Arts getting you a C scaling in strength and dexterity and a B scaling in intelligence. Like in all of these instances, you're just going to get more damage at these higher levels once you've already hit the soft caps for intelligence. And the best part about this infusion is that you benefit of a whole bunch of frost buildup. Now the frost status effect doesn't actually scale with anything, but typically it's always going to give you over 100 frost buildup, and you can proc frost really quickly, and the status effect is just amazing, because not only is it going to result in a decent amount of percentage damage, but it also debuffs enemies to make them take 20% more damage over the next 30 seconds. So yeah, not only can this infusion just directly outclass magic infusions, but it can be a very good alternative to strength, dexterity, or even quality-based infusions too. At number 3, we have the Keen Infusion, which this just gives you a pure dexterity scaling and nothing else. You still have the ability to buff the weapon, and it just gives you a whole bunch of damage. The thing is, with a heavy and Keen Infusion, that is always going to be the best when it comes to maximizing damage, because one, you're not doing split damage, and you get like some of the best scalings. There'll be some weapons out there that can even get an S scaling in dexterity, and typically with dexterity-based weapons, they're going to be relatively quick, and a handful of them actually coming with passive bleed, and with the ability to be buffed, you can pair it alongside things like Blood Flame Blade, and not only can you just get ridiculous amounts of damage, but you can get some really solid blood loss build up too. And best of all yet, when it does come to dexterity builds, there are lots of different skills out there that will scale purely off this. So all your lightning based skills, even stuff like Stormblade, even the cold based skills actually scale really well off dexterity. And when going with a Keen based infusion, you're going to get a really high dexterity scaling, hence maximizing the damage of those particular skills. Number 2, we have the Occult Infusion, which this one does give you a very good arcane scaling, does just still retain pure physical damage, unfortunately does not have the ability to be buffed, but getting a whole dedicated infusion that gives you a pure arcane scaling is good in so many different ways. The best one being is going to be its synergy with the poison and bleed based weapons, because both bleed and poison do scale off arcane, but for most infusible weapons that have passive bleed or poison, don't actually come with an arcane scaling, so therefore going into the arcane stats doesn't actually improve the status buildup. So if you have an Uchigatana with a regular infusion, going into arcane doesn't do anything for you. But if you paired it alongside an infusion that actually did have an arcane scaling, things like bleed, poison, and occult, going into the arcane stats will improve the bleed buildup. And with the occult infusion, you actually get the best arcane scaling out of the 3. So therefore, you're not only going to maximize your status buildup, but also your damage too. So with weapons that already have passive bleed, there's practically no reason to actually go into a bleed infusion, because it doesn't actually add on to the bleed. You're just going to get just as much blood loss build up as you would with any other weapon, but you're just going to take a major hit in terms of base damage. But if you're just going to go like an occult, keen, or heavy infusion, you're not going to get as much of a hit in terms of base damage, but you still can get amazing bleed build up with these weapons, and almost just as much as a bleed infusion, especially if you use Blood Flame Blade for those keen and heavy infusions. So that's kind of one of the reasons why the blood infusion didn't really get that high. And it's purely because that Blood Flame Blade exists and that this infusion exists too. And you can maximize the damage of all the really good bleed and poison based weapon skills. Things like Blood Blade, Bloody Slash, Poison Flower, Blooms Twice, Seppuku, they're all going to scale purely off arcane and your arcane scaling, and they're going to be best with an occult based infusion. And probably better than all that, it just synergizes perfectly with the Dragon Communion Seal, which is like the best seal in the entire game. So not only can you get like a pure physical, really good damaging infusion that can maximize some of the best status effects, but you can also get really good spell damage too and maximize the damage of some of the best spells in the game. I think the only downside with the occult infusion is that at earlier levels, it kind of just sucks, because with lower amounts of stat investment and at lower scalings, you're not going to really get much blood loss build up, and you're probably much better off going into like a heavy or a keen infusion, especially if you're going to be going with these weapons that get passive bleed. But once you get to a bit later into the game, the occult infusion can become one of the best. And that's number 1, we have the heavy infusion. I think this is like the single most useful infusion in the entire game, because similar to how I see the keen infusion, this one can just help maximize the damage. You're just going to be doing pure physical damage. You get some amazing scaling, some weapons getting A or S scalings in strength, and it can house some of the best weapon options in the entire game too. Things like the Star Fist, Guts' Greatsword, Giant Crusher, Sword Lance, Frosted Anchor, all these weapons scale best off strength. And on top of all that, they can be buffed too. But the main reason why heavy gets number 1 is because of the two-handed bonus. When you two-hand your weapon, it gives you a 50% boost to your strength scaling. And it's to the point that if you just two-hand the weapon, you're just going to be getting way more damage, basically just for free. And this is even true for dexterity builds as well. Let's just say you have like an Uchigatana, which is very much a dexterity-based weapon. When you have like a 60 dexterity keen infusion compared to like a 60 strength heavy infusion, obviously the keen infusion is going to get you more damage. But if you two-hand the weapon, then literally it scales better off strength. So with all those things combined, the amazing damage output, the fact that almost every single infusible weapon for most part of the game is just going to be best with a heavy infusion. And there are also a handful of skills that purely scale off strength that are just going to benefit most when you're going into a heavy infusion too. Things like Ground Slam, Horrorloo's Earthshaker, a lot of the fire-based Ashes of War too, Flame of the Red Mane's Flaming Strike. You just maximize your damage most with this particular infusion. Now, you might think that the major downside to having a strength-based build would be that you just lack synergy with certain types of spells, but the thing is you have the claw mark seal. So one of the only weaknesses that strength might typically have is pretty much counteracted. Anyway, that is that video now done and completed. Just let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. Once again, don't really focus too much on like the placement of the actual ranking itself, because every single one of these affinities or infusions do have its own use. But yeah, catch you guys on the next. See ya.